I found out my husband sold my own company out from under me by reading it in a text message he forgot to delete, a text to the woman he'd been sleeping with for 18 months, telling her it was finally done and they could stop hiding. Good day, listeners. It's Vivian Marsh here, and I'm 44 years old. Before I continue, like and subscribe and leave your comment. You're going to want to talk about this one. Let me back up because you need to understand what done meant. For 15 years, I built Hayes and Home from a card table in my garage. I was the designer. I was the one who could walk into a dated, ugly ranch house and see what it could become. Richard, my husband, handled the books. That was the arrangement. I made the magic. He made the spreadsheets. It felt like a partnership. It felt like a marriage. By year 12, Hayes and Home had 3 locations, 22 employees, and a waiting list 6 months long. Local magazines called me the woman with the golden eye. Richard liked to stand next to me at ribbon cuttings and shake hands like he'd swung a hammer himself. He hadn't swung anything. Not even close. The morning I found that text, I was sitting in our kitchen. My kitchen, the one I designed down to the cabinet pulls, going through his phone because he'd left it charging on the counter and a notification popped up from someone named D. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was checking the time. And then I wasn't checking the time anymore. I was reading 18 months of a life I didn't know I was living. D was Deidre Voss. She'd been our bookkeeper's assistant for 2 years. Sweet smile, brought donuts on Fridays. I'd trained her myself. I confronted Richard that night. He didn't even flinch. I was going to tell you, he said, like that made it better. Tell me what, Richard? That you're sleeping with a 29-year-old or that you sold my company? His face did something I'd never seen before. Calm, almost bored. It's our company, Viv, and it's done. I sold 60% of Hayes and Home to an investment group last week. Deidre's dad runs it, if you're curious. I laughed. I actually laughed because it sounded so insane I thought it had to be a joke. You can't sell what you don't own, I said. I own 60% of that business. I have the paperwork. You had 60%, he said. Check the operating agreement you signed in 2019. The one for the tax restructuring? You signed over decision-making authority to me as managing member. I've had the legal right to do this for years, Viv. I just never needed to use it. Until now. I remember my knees actually going weak. I'd trusted him with the paperwork because I trusted him with my life. That's what 15 years does to you. It makes you skip the fine print because you think the person across the table loves you. He didn't love me. He'd been building an exit for 2 years, quietly diverting funds, quietly courting a buyer, quietly falling in love with a woman half his age who thought I was just the artistic one who didn't understand business. Within a week, I was locked out of the design software I'd used for a decade. My employee badge stopped working. My name was scrubbed from the website and replaced with Hayes and Home under new creative direction, Deidre Voss. My own clients started getting calls from her, welcoming them to the next chapter. Richard filed for divorce 4 days after that. His lawyer called it amicable. I called it a mugging with a wedding ring attached. The court fight over the business took 8 months and drained what little savings I'd kept separate. In the end, because of that operating agreement, I walked away with a settlement that covered exactly one thing. My dignity was not for sale, but apparently my company was, and I hadn't even been in the room. During those 8 months of court fights, I want to tell you about the day I understood exactly what kind of man I'd married. We were in mediation, sitting across a conference table, and Richard's lawyer slid a folder toward my lawyer like he was dealing cards in a game he'd already rigged. My client is willing to be generous, the lawyer said, given the circumstances. Generous, I repeated. He stole my company, and you're calling a settlement generous. Richard didn't even look at me. He looked at his phone. It's not stealing if it's legal, Viv. I didn't break any laws. I just read the paperwork more carefully than you did. You wrote the paperwork, Richard. You had your lawyer write it in 2019 and you told me it was standard tax language. You told me not to worry about it because you'd handle the boring stuff so I could focus on the design work. Do you remember saying that? I remember you signing it, he said. Without reading it, that's on you. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip that conference table. Instead, I sat there in a blazer I couldn't really afford anymore, and I said, very quietly, "You're going to regret saying that to me one day." He laughed. Actually laughed right there in mediation, like I'd told a joke. Sure, Viv, sure I will. I didn't know yet how right I was. But something in me hardened in that room, some final soft edge of hope that he might still feel guilty, might still do the decent thing. That edge just closed over like a wound scarring shut. From that moment on, I stopped trying to make him understand what he'd taken from me. I started, instead, quietly cataloging every lie, every excuse, every smug little comment, because some part of me, the part that had built a company from a card table, already knew I was going to need it all again someday. The final settlement, when it came, was almost insulting in its smallness. Enough to cover legal fees and rent for a few months. Not enough to start over. Not enough to even feel like a consolation. My lawyer, a kind older woman named Pat, who'd clearly seen this story 100 times, patted my hand across the table after the papers were signed. "For what it's worth," she said, "the ones who gloat the loudest in the room usually get the quietest ending. I've seen it more times than I can count." I didn't believe her. Not that day. I was too busy watching Richard and Deidre walk out of the building together, her hand already resting on his arm like she'd been practicing the gesture for months. I sat in my empty apartment because he kept the house too, with one suitcase, a laptop, and $41,000 to my name, and I thought about giving up. I really did, for about 6 hours. Then I thought about the woman who built a company from a card table in a garage, and I thought, she's still in here somewhere? I just have to go find her. So I packed that one suitcase, sold what furniture I had left, and bought a one-way ticket to New York City. I didn't know a single soul there. I was 42 years old, starting completely over in a city that eats people like me for breakfast. I remember standing on the sidewalk outside my new apartment, a 400-square-foot studio above a dry cleaner in Queens, and thinking, okay, zero. This is zero. Everything from here is mine. The first 3 months in New York nearly broke me. I took freelance design consultations for anyone who'd pay me, sometimes for less than I used to charge for a single throw pillow. I worked a second job folding shirts at a boutique on weekends just to make rent. I cried in that dry cleaner-scented apartment more nights than I want to admit on a public video, but I never once picked up the phone to call Richard and ask for anything. Not 1 cent. My pride was the only thing he hadn't managed to steal, and I was going to keep it if it killed me. There was one night, about 2 months in, that I think about a lot. I'd just lost a small consulting gig because the client decided at the last minute to go with her nephew, who did design as a hobby. And I remember sitting on the floor of that 400-square-foot studio, surrounded by fabric swatches I couldn't afford to turn into anything, eating cold noodles out of a takeout container, and genuinely asking myself if I'd made a terrible mistake leaving everything behind for a city that didn't know I existed and didn't care. My phone buzzed, a text from an old friend back home, someone who'd stayed loosely in touch after the divorce. Heard Richard and Deidre got engaged. Sorry, Viv. Thought you should know before you saw it online. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but I'll tell you anyway because I think a lot of you have done the same thing at your lowest point. I looked up Deidre's social media. Photos of her at Hayes and home events, standing where I used to stand, smiling at people I used to call clients, wearing a ring that used to represent my marriage. My old company's Instagram had 4 times the followers it had when I left, because apparently a scandal and a young pretty face is good for engagement. Whatever the ethics, I put the phone down, face first on the floor, and then, because I am who I am, I picked it back up 10 minutes later and opened my laptop instead. I didn't cry about it again after that night. I worked. That's always been my answer to grief. I don't recommend it as the healthiest coping mechanism in the world, but it kept me moving, and moving was what I needed most. I took every job. I redesigned a laundromat's front counter for $200 just to have a commercial project listed on my new portfolio site. I did a nursery for a woman 8 months pregnant who paid me half in cash and half in homemade lasagna, and I ate that lasagna like it was a 5-star meal, because it was made with kindness and I hadn't tasted much of that in a long time. Slowly, painfully, one unglamorous job at a time, Vivian Marsh, designer, started to mean something in a city of 8 million people who had never heard of Hayes and home and never would. The turning point came on a Tuesday in March, at the worst possible moment, the way these things always do. I'd landed a small consulting job, staging a boutique hotel lobby in Tribeca. Low pay but good exposure, the kind of job you take because you need the portfolio piece. The client was renovating on a shoestring, and I was making magic out of secondhand furniture and clever lighting, exactly like I used to. The lobby was almost done when the building's actual owner walked in unannounced. I didn't know who he was. I just knew a tall man in a charcoal coat walked through the door, looked around the half-finished space, and said, "Who approved putting the reception desk facing the wrong way?" I didn't back down. That's not who I am, even on my worst day. I did, I said, because in about 6 weeks, when the afternoon sun comes through those west windows, anyone facing the old direction is going to be blinded and squinting in every photo your guests post online. I moved it so the light frames your staff instead of attacking them. Also, your marble supplier upcharged you 11% above market rate. I already emailed your project manager the invoice comparison. He stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, he almost smiled. "Who are you, Vivian Marsh?" "I'm the designer nobody introduced to you because apparently nobody thought that was necessary." "Marcus Kane," he said. "I own this building, and about 40 others like it." I'd heard the name. Everyone in that industry had. Marcus Kane was one of those self-made stories people write books about. Started with one rundown motel outside Newark 20 years ago, built it into a hospitality empire through sheer stubbornness and an eye for undervalued real estate. He didn't inherit anything. He clawed his way up, and he had zero patience for people who hadn't. "You're not what I expected from the invoice you sent my PM," he said. "That email was ruthless. Your marble supplier is stealing from you. I don't apologize for saying so." "No apology requested." He looked around the lobby again. Really looked this time. "You did all this with the budget my PM told me about?" "I did all this in spite of the budget your PM told me about." That got a real laugh out of him. Not polite, genuine. "I like you," he said. "I don't like many people have dinner with my development team Thursday. Not a date, a job interview disguised as dinner. So nobody feels awkward about it. I want to be very clear with you, because this matters for later. Marcus Kane never once tried to save me. He never offered me charity, never framed a single opportunity as a favor. What he offered was respect, which after Richard felt like discovering oxygen for the first time in a year. He saw the work. He didn't see a woman who needed rescuing. He saw a mind he wanted at his table. Over the next year, Marcus became something between a mentor and the older brother I never had. He fed me projects that stretched me. He introduced me to investors, contractors, city officials, all the connective tissue you need in a city like New York that takes most people a decade to build. He never once asked for anything in return that made me uncomfortable. And the one time an executive on his team implied there must be something else going on. Marcus fired the insinuation out of the room so fast, the man apologized to me before the meeting even ended. I built this empire because people underestimated me for being a nobody from Newark with a GED and a dream. Marcus told me once, over coffee in his office, the city spread out behind him like a promise. I don't underestimate talent when I see it in front of me. You've got the eye. I've got the buildings. Let's stop wasting each other's time. That dinner Thursday night, the one he'd framed as a job interview disguised as a meal, turned out to be one of the harder rooms I'd sat in that year. 6 of his development executives, all men, all clearly skeptical of the woman their boss had invited off the street of a half-finished lobby renovation. One of them, a sharp-suited man named Foster, didn't even wait for the appetizers before he started testing me. "So, what's your design philosophy?" he asked. In a tone that suggested he already had an answer he wanted me to fail to give, function that photographs well and holds up after 200 check-ins. I said, "Pretty is easy. Durable and pretty is the job. And your background?" Marcus mentioned a company back in, where was it, Ohio? "I built and ran a design firm for 15 years, I said. "I lost it in a divorce to a husband who forged the fine print. I'm not going to pretend that part away because I imagine you already looked it up before I sat down, and I'd rather you hear it from me than from some old headline." The table went quiet. Marcus, at the head of it, watched with an expression I couldn't quite read yet back then. Foster pressed on, clearly enjoying himself. "So, you're rebuilding on my boss's dime." "I'm rebuilding on my own talent," I said. "Your boss's buildings just happen to need someone who's good at this. If you'd like to test that, give me one afternoon in your worst-performing property, and I'll show you the difference in the numbers within a quarter." Marcus set his glass down and smiled for the first time all dinner. "Foster, give her the Hartwell property. The one on 42nd that's been bleeding money for 2 years." Foster blinked. "Marcus, that's not really. That's exactly the test," Marcus said. "Let's see if she's as good as she says she is." I redesigned the Hartwell lobby and lounge in 6 weeks, on a budget half of what previous consultants had asked for, and occupancy in the connected boutique rooms went up 18% within the following quarter. Foster never apologized directly, but he started forwarding me projects of his own after that, which in that world was as close to an apology as you were going to get. Marcus never once brought up the Hartwell numbers to gloat on my behalf, and he never let anyone else use my past against me again in front of him. That's the thing about real respect. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly closes doors that used to be open to cruelty. With his backing, not his money, his introductions, I launched my own firm. I called it Marsh Atelier. No Richard, no Hayes, just me, unhidden, unhyphenated. Finally, it grew fast. Faster than Hayes and Home ever had, because this time I owned every single decision, every contract, every clause. I had learned that lesson in blood. Within 2 years, Marsh Atelier had contracts with 3 boutique hotel groups, a magazine feature of my own, the design mind rebuilding Manhattan's boutique scene, and a staff of 14 who I paid on time every time, because I remembered exactly what it felt like when someone with power decided your work didn't matter. I was, for the first time in my adult life, entirely, unmistakably mine. Which brings us to the night everything I'd rebuilt almost got taken from me a second time. Marsh Atelier was throwing its biggest event yet, the launch gala for a full building renovation partnership with 3 of Marcus Kane's boutique properties, presented to a room of 40 elite investors, half the city's design press, and enough old money that the champagne budget alone could have paid my queen's rent for a decade. This was the pitch that would take me from up and coming to arrived. Marcus himself was going to stand up and personally vouch for the partnership in front of the room. This was everything. 3 days before the gala, my assistant Priya burst into my office holding her phone like it was on fire. "Vivian, you need to see this." It was a blog, a gossip-adjacent design industry blog with a following just big enough to matter, titled "The Real Story Behind Marsh Atelier's Rise." The byline was anonymous. The content was not. It called me a fraud who'd stolen creative concepts and client lists from my previous company, Hayes and Home, during my divorce. It quoted an unnamed insider claiming I'd used manipulation and feminine charm to secure Marcus Kane's backing, insinuating, not so subtly, that I was some kind of gold digger who'd traded one wealthy man for another the moment the first one was inconvenient. It claimed Hayes and Home was preparing legal action against Marsh Atelier for breach of a non-compete clause I'd supposedly signed years ago. I felt my stomach drop through the floor. Not because it was true, because I knew, instantly, exactly who was behind it. I found out later, piecing it together from Priya's contacts in the design world, what had actually set this off. Hayes and Home had been struggling, badly. Without my eye for design, without the reputation I'd spent 15 years earning, the company had been coasting on old client relationships that were quietly drying up one by one as people realized the new creative direction meant worse work at the same prices. Deirdre's father's investment group was reportedly furious, threatening to pull funding unless things turned around fast. And then the magazine feature on me had come out, the design mind rebuilding Manhattan's boutique scene. With my face on it, my name, my story of rebuilding from nothing, right around the same time Hayes and Home's numbers were cratering. I imagine Richard sitting in his office, seeing that headline and feeling something ugly and small curdle in his chest. Not guilt. Never guilt. Not from that man. Just a desperate, jealous need to drag me back down to wherever he'd decided I belonged, because watching me succeed without him was apparently more than his ego could survive. I called the number listed for Hayes and Home's press inquiries myself. Blocking my caller ID, Dieter Voss answered. "Hayes and Home, this is Dieter. It's Vivian." Dead silence for 3 full seconds. Then sickly sweet. "Vivian, what a surprise." "Cut it. I saw the blog. I know exactly what this is." "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The same smile she used to give me over Friday donuts before I knew what she really was. "You and Richard are going to regret this?" I said. "Are we?" "Because, from where I'm sitting, you're the one about to lose your big gala in front of the entire industry. Richard has the paperwork, Vivian, the non-compete. You signed it, it's real, and once your precious investors see it, they're going to wonder what else you've been hiding from them." I hung up without another word, because I already knew what I needed to do. I'd learned this lesson once in a kitchen, reading a text I wasn't supposed to see. I was never again going to walk into a room without knowing exactly what was in every drawer. I spent the next 48 hours barely sleeping. I called my lawyer. I called my old accountant, the one honest person who'd worked at Hayes and Home under Richard and quietly quit 2 years ago because, in her words, the books didn't smell right. I called Marcus. My old accountant, a careful woman named Rosa, who'd kept her head down through my entire divorce and never taken sides publicly, met me at a diner in Elmhurst instead of anywhere near my office because she was still nervous about being seen with me. I always kept copies, she told me, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table like it was contraband. Not to use against anyone, just in case someone ever accused me of touching money I never touched. You understand? I understand completely, I said. There's things in here that are going to make you very angry, she warned. I've been angry for 2 years, Rosa. I can handle a little more. She wasn't wrong. Reading through those statements that night, alone in my apartment, I found transfer after transfer, disguised behind vague line items, all of it routed to a consulting firm with an address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be a UPS mailbox in Wilmington, Delaware. $400,000. Money that should have gone to payroll, to materials, to the 22 employees I used to know by name and now had no idea what had happened to. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my dining table with Rosa's records spread out in front of me. A legal pad covered in my own handwriting, cross-referencing dates against the timeline of Richard and Deirdre's relationship, against the timeline of the divorce filing, against the timeline of the sale. By 4 a.m, I had a complete picture, and it was worse and more calculated than I'd even let myself believe during the divorce. This wasn't a man who'd fallen in love and made a mistake. This was a man who had been quietly stealing from his own company for years, using the affair and the eventual sale as cover for money that had already been disappearing long before Deirdre ever brought him a Friday donut. I called my lawyer at 7 that morning, records in hand, and I remember her exact words when she saw the pattern laid out. Vivian, she said, this isn't just embarrassing for them anymore. This is actionable. This is the kind of thing that ends careers, not just marriages. Good, I said. Then let's make sure it ends the right one. Tell me what you need, he said, the second I explained it. Not what you want me to do, what you need. I need you to trust me in that room Saturday night, I said. No matter what happens in the first 5 minutes, I need you to let me handle it and just be ready to back me when I ask. Done, he said, without a single question. That was Marcus. He'd earned his empire by trusting his gut about people. And his gut, apparently, had already decided about me a long time ago. Here's what my old accountant handed me, sitting in a diner booth with her hands shaking around a coffee cup. 3 years of Hayes and Home's internal financial records she'd quietly kept copies of before she left, because she'd been afraid exactly this kind of thing would happen one day and wanted proof she'd never touched the money herself. Those records showed a pattern of transfers from company accounts into a shell entity registered under Richard Hayes and Deirdre Voss's joint names, going back to 18 months before our divorce was even filed. Nearly $400,000 quietly bled out of a company I'd built, funneled into personal accounts, disguised as consulting fees paid to a consulting firm that, as far as my accountant could tell, did not actually exist, and the so-called non-compete. My lawyer found it in about 10 minutes. It was real, technically. I had signed it. In 2019, during the same tax restructuring paperwork where Richard had also slipped in that operating agreement clause that let him sell my company without my consent. Except my lawyer found something Richard's lawyer clearly hadn't checked closely. The non-compete named Hayes and Home LLC as the protected entity. But Hayes and Home LLC had been legally dissolved and reformed as a new entity, Hayes and Home Holdings, Inc. The same month, Richard sold his 60% stake to Deirdre's father's investment group. The non-compete protected a company that legally no longer existed. It was worthless paper being waved around like a weapon. By Friday night, I had everything I needed laid out on my dining table like a battle map. The financial records, the dissolution filings, and one more thing, a voicemail. Deirdre, 3 days earlier, gloating to someone on speakerphone in what she clearly thought was a private moment before hanging up on our old shared work voicemail system out of habit, not realizing the message had been captured and forwarded automatically to an archive she'd forgotten still existed from her assistant days. In it, she laughed about how Richard's blog guy was going to bury that woman before her little party even starts. I had my proof, now I just needed the room. The night of the gala, Marsh Atelier's launch space glittered like something out of the magazine feature I'd once only dreamed of being in. 40 of the city's sharpest investors, press with cameras already rolling for arrival shots. Marcus Kane in a black tux near the bar, watching the door the way a man watches for trouble he already knows is coming. I was in deep blue hairback, calm on the outside in a way that took every ounce of the discipline 15 years of humiliation had built in me. Inside, my heart was a drum. Priya found me in the small side room we were using to stage materials 15 minutes before doors opened and grabbed both my hands. "You don't have to do this tonight," she said. "We could postpone. Call security if they show up. You don't have to give a speech about your ex-husband in front of investors." "Yes, I do," I said. "If I don't handle this here, tonight, in front of everyone, it follows me forever. Every deal, every gala, every magazine feature, there'll always be a blog post somewhere waiting to resurface. I'm done running from paperwork I didn't write. Tonight I write the ending." Priya squeezed my hands once and let go. "Then go be terrifying." "That's the plan," I said, and I meant it. Richard and Deidre arrived 20 minutes into the cocktail hour. Uninvited. I'd expected that. What I hadn't fully braced for was watching them walk in arm, both of them dressed like they were the ones being honored. Richard's chin up in that same infuriating way he used to stand at Hayes and Home ribbon cuttings, taking credit for a life he hadn't built. Deidre made a beeline for a cluster of investors near the champagne table, loud enough for the room to hear. "I'm so glad we made it," she said, false and bright. "Someone has to be here to make sure tonight's presentation is honest." A few heads turned. Exactly the reaction she wanted. Richard raised his voice next, playing to the room like he'd rehearsed it, which he probably had. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you invest a single dollar tonight, you should know that Vivian Marsh built this so-called new venture using stolen client relationships and proprietary design concepts from Hayes and Home, a company she's legally barred from competing against. We have documentation. This entire gala is built on a fraud." The room did that thing rooms do when a bomb goes off quietly. A ripple of murmurs, glasses lowering, phones subtly angling upward to film. A journalist near the back actually started typing on her phone in real time. I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the tension to peak. Then I walked to the small stage at the front of the room, took the microphone from the event coordinator's hand, and smiled, not warmly. "Precisely. Actually," I said, my voice carrying clean and steady across the room, "I was hoping you'd come tonight, Richard. Saves me the trouble of mailing you a copy." The room went dead quiet. "For those of you who don't know," I continued, "this is my ex-husband, Richard Hayes, and this is Deidre Voss, the woman he had an affair with for 18 months while she worked at the company I built. When our marriage ended, Richard used a legal loophole he'd quietly written into our operating agreement, without my knowledge, to sell 60% of that company out from under me. I share this not for sympathy. I share it because Richard just stood in this room and accused me of violating a non-compete agreement tied to Hayes and Home, LLC. I nodded to the screen behind me, and my events tech pulled up the first slide. The state filing. Hayes and Home LLC was legally dissolved 14 months ago. It no longer exists. It was restructured into Hayes Home Holdings Incorporated on the exact same date Richard sold his stake to Deidre's father. The document he's currently waving around in this room protects a company that is, on paper, dead. I checked. My lawyer checked. It took 10 minutes. Deidre's smile finally cracked. Richard's face went the color of the tablecloths. That's a technicality," Richard said, too loud, his voice climbing the way it always did when he was losing an argument he thought he'd already won. "No," I said. "A technicality is a small oversight. This is what happens when you spend more time building an affair than reading your own paperwork." A few laughs, sharp and surprised, rippled through the crowd. I let it land before continuing. "You flew in from a city you don't even live in anymore," I said to Richard, "with a document that doesn't protect anything, to accuse me of fraud in front of the one man in this industry whose reputation actually matters. That takes a special kind of confidence, Richard. I'll give you that." "This isn't a joke, Vivian," Richard snapped, his voice climbing again, the way it always did right before he lost control of a room entirely. "You think a technicality erases what you did? You built this company on relationships you poached from mine." "Which relationships exactly?" I asked, calm as still water. "Name one client in this room tonight who was ever a client of Hayes and Home." "Go ahead, I'll wait." Silence. He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. Every single person in that room had come to me through 2 years of my own work in New York. Work Richard had never seen, never touched. never once acknowledged existed until it became inconvenient for him. Deidre finally found her voice, shrill and defensive now that her earlier bright confidence had started to crack at the edges. "You don't understand what it's been like, watching you parade around in magazines like you're some kind of victim, when everyone knows you." "Everyone knows I what, Deidre?" I said, turning to her fully now. "Finish that sentence. I'd love to hear it, in front of everyone." She didn't finish it. She couldn't. There was nothing at the end of that sentence except her own resentment, and resentment doesn't hold up well under bright lights and 40 pairs of watching eyes. But since we're here, and since Richard opened the door to talking about honesty tonight, let's talk about honesty. Second slide, the financial records. Over the last 3 years, nearly $400,000 was quietly transferred out of Hayes and Holmes accounts into a shell company jointly owned by Richard Hayes and Deidre Voss, disguised as consulting fees paid to a firm that does not, as far as any public record shows, actually exist. These are the internal statements. I'd invite any accountant in this room to look them over. I watched Deidre grab Richard's arm, her mouth opening to say something, nothing coming out. Third slide. I hadn't wanted to use this one. I told myself I'd only pull it out if they left me no choice. They left me no choice. And in case anyone still believes tonight's ambush was some kind of good faith concern for investor safety, I said, here's a voicemail Deidre left 3 days ago that she may not remember still gets archived automatically. I played 11 seconds of it. That was all I needed, her own voice tinny through the speakers, laughing about burying me before my party even started. The room's reaction wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the specific, total silence of 40 powerful people simultaneously deciding, in real time, exactly who they were never doing business with again. A journalist near the front finally broke it. "Ms. Hayes, sorry, Ms. Voss. Do you have any response to the financial allegations?" Deidre had nothing. Richard grabbed her wrist and started pulling her toward the door, muttering something about lawyers, about defamation, about how this wasn't over. That's when Marcus Kane, who had been standing quietly by the bar this entire time, letting me run my own room exactly the way he'd promised, finally spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough that every phone in the room caught it. "For the record," Marcus said, "I've done business in this city for 20 years and I've backed exactly one design partnership without hesitation in the last decade. It's the one standing on that stage. Everyone in this room is welcome to draw their own conclusions about the two people currently walking toward the exit." He didn't need to say more than that. He never did. That's the kind of weight real respect carries. It doesn't have to shout. I set the microphone down, looked directly at Richard as he reached the door, and said the only thing I had left for him. "You spent 15 years telling me I was the artistic one who didn't understand business. Turns out I understood it well enough to read estate filing. Enjoy the lawyers, Richard." The door closed behind them to the sound of 40 people going back to their champagne like nothing had happened at all, because in the world that mattered, the world of investors, contracts, and reputations, nothing that mattered to them had. What happened to Richard and Deidre. My gala continued exactly as planned. We closed 3 new hotel partnership deals before midnight. The blog post disappeared within 48 hours, quietly scrubbed, no explanation given, after the design press picked up the story with the actual documentation attached. Deidre's father's investment group issued a statement 2 weeks later reevaluating its position in Hayes and Home Holdings, which is corporate language for exactly what you think it means. The last I heard through mutual acquaintances I no longer speak to, Hayes and Home was operating out of a single small office with a skeleton staff, its client list a fraction of what it used to be. Most of its old customers having quietly migrated to firms that weren't embroiled in a very public fraud scandal. Richard tried to call me twice in the weeks after. I let both calls go to voicemail. He left one message, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, saying he'd made mistakes and wanted to talk, just talk for old time's sake. I never called back. About 3 weeks after the gala, he tried a different approach. He showed up in person, outside my office building, waiting near the entrance like he used to wait for me outside client meetings back when we were still married, and I still thought that was sweet instead of controlling. Priya spotted him first and came to warn me before I walked out. "He's out there," she said. "Should I call building security?" "No," I said. "I've got this." I walked outside, and I have to tell you, listeners, some small, stubborn part of me expected to feel something when I saw him, fear maybe, or old habit, some flicker of the 15 years we'd shared. I felt nothing. Genuinely nothing. He looked older than I remembered, smaller, somehow, standing there in a coat that used to look sharp on him and now just looked like a man trying too hard. Vivian, please. Just 5 minutes. You have one, I said, checking my phone, not even bothering to look up at him fully. I know what I did was wrong. I know that now. Deirdre's father pulled out of the company. It's basically over. I've lost almost everything. And I keep thinking about what we had before all this. I made a mistake, Viv. People make mistakes. People make mistakes, I repeated. You made a decision. You spent 2 years planning an exit while sleeping with a woman I trained myself, and then you stood in a room full of my future business partners and tried to call me a fraud to save your own failing company. That's not a mistake, Richard. That's a character. So that's it? 15 years? And that's it. 15 years taught me exactly what you are, I said. I'm not angry anymore. I want you to understand that, because I think it'll bother you more than anger would. I'm not angry. I just don't think about you. You're not a wound anymore, Richard. You're barely a memory. I walked back inside. He didn't follow. He didn't call again after that either. About 4 months later, I ran into Deirdre by accident at a hardware store of all places, both of us reaching for the same shade of paint sample. She looked different, tired in a way makeup couldn't quite cover. Vivian, she said, and her voice actually cracked. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm sorry for everything. It got out of control. Richard convinced me the blog was a good idea, and I just went along with it. And I know that's not an excuse, but I looked at her the way you'd look at someone selling something you have absolutely no use for. You're right, I said. That's not an excuse. I took my paint sample and walked to the register, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction. Nothing at all, which was somehow the most freeing feeling I'd had in years. She wasn't my enemy anymore. She wasn't anything. She was just a woman standing in a hardware store, and I had a business to run. 2 years later, Marsh Atelier has offices in 3 cities. Marcus Kane and I still have coffee every few months. Still purely business. Still exactly as respectful and boundary clear as the day we met in that half-finished lobby. I own 100% of my company. Every clause of every contract I read 3 times before I sign, and I have a lawyer read it a 4th. I learned that lesson once, and I promise you listeners I will never need to learn it twice. Richard and Deirdre are, as far as I know, still together, still running whatever's left of Hayes and Home. I genuinely don't know, and I want you to understand what I mean when I say that. I don't know, and I don't care to find out. That's not bitterness talking. That's peace. Real peace, the kind you can't fake, is when someone who used to be able to destroy your whole life becomes a person you simply don't think about anymore. So here's my question for you tonight, and I really do read every single comment. Have you ever found the strength to completely cut out toxic people from your life and watch karma do its job? Or did you feel the need to prove something to them? Comment below. I read all your stories.